Good morning, students. Today I am going to speak on a very interesting topic which I am sure you will all like, and that is about food. We generally talk so much about food, but today I am going to take you through a long journey of how Indian food and cuisine developed. So we are going to look at food in a historical perspective, and this is very important because we can only then understand how our food has developed over a period of time. Today, as we know, any well-known Indian dish, it's a product of a long history of invasion and fusion of different foods and traditions. The food which we Indians have been eating over the millennia, it steadily evolved over a period of time, and it varies a lot in terms of taste and variety. The food habit and the preferences of the Indians have changed in stages over the last 4,000 years. And if we go back into the history, right from the time of Indus Valley civilization to the Vedic times, and even as a result of the coming of the Buddhist period, the Jain thought, the Dharma Sutras, the Arthashastras, and the coming of Mughals, Europeans, all of them have added different dimensions to our food, and therefore it becomes very important to look at the whole growth of food in a historical perspective. Now, we have come to know a lot about the Indus Valley civilization through the excavations which have been carried out at Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. And we have found that they used wide platforms. You know, these were like wide scaled pounding platforms which were used on a very large scale by the state. And most probably the homes had small pounders which were employed in the home, and it was here that the pounding activities were carried out. We have also found certain flat metal and clay plates which resemble the modern day tawa, and a large number of them have been discovered from the Harappan sites, and this clearly shows that baked chapatis may have been known to the people from Harappa. Besides this, we have also discovered a large number of clay vessels, and most of these vessels must have been used for boiling barley and rice. So, most probably the Indus Valley people did boil barley and rice. We have also found a large number of chulas which are in a U shape with the opening in the front, and it had 3 knobs at the top to support the cooking vessel, you know, something which you can even find today in a village. So in that sense we can really see a lot of continuity in our historical tradition. The kind of chulas which were being used in the Indus Valley civilization continue to be used in a large number of houses in rural areas. And besides this, in the northwestern part of India, we have also discovered small mud plastered ovens which resemble like any modern day tandoor, and which are very much a part of the cooking in Punjab and other northwestern regions. So again, you know, if you look at the way the tawa is used, or the way the chulas are used, the way they use the tandoors, we find that there is some kind of a continuity in the way the chapati was being used, and the way they were using the chapatis. As far as the food in the Indus Valley civilization is concerned, we have also found that around 7000 BC, sesames, eggplant and humped cattle were domesticated by the Indus Valley people. By 300 BC, we find that turmeric, cardamom, black pepper and mustard were also harvested in India. Therefore, there is a lot of similarity in the kind of ingredients that the Indian household uses for cooking today and the Indus Valley civilization. At various sites in Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, we have found wheat and barley. We also know that the Indus Valley people were familiar with chickpea, masoor dal, horse gram and chana. They were also familiar with fruits like pomegranate, coconuts and banana. Mostly the way they used the wheat was made into a stew, either soup or flat, and it was eaten with breads called chapatis. Now when the Aryans came into India, it did not really change the food structure of India. Whereas the Harappan civilization was essentially an urban one, the Vedic civilization was an agricultural one, it was pastoral and philosophical and keenly alive to the forces within, without that effect which would affect human equanimity and comfort. So, you have that kind of a balance which is drawn between a human being and nature in this civilization. It is very interesting to see a prayer from the Yajurveda. This is composed about 800 BC and it reads like this: "May for me prosper through the sacrifice, milk, sap, ghee, honey, eating and drinking at the common table, ploughing, rains, conquest, victory, wealth, riches. May for me prosper through the sacrifice, low-grade food, freedom from hunger, rice, barley, sesame, kidney beans, vetches, wheat, lentils, millet, pansium grains and wild rice. May for me prosper through the sacrifice, trees, plants that grow with plowed land and that which grows in outplowed land." So, this is basically an ode to food, the kinds of crop they are growing and seeking for prosperity in the growth of these crops and also the human beings who are eating these crops. What is very interesting is that the Rig Veda mentions neither rice nor wheat, but there is a lot of mention of barley in the text. But the Yajurveda mentions all the three, it mentions rice, wheat and barley, and besides this it also mentions panicum cereal, oil seed and pulses such as ashtamasha, that is the urad of present day, masoor, masura, that is the masoor, and mudga, the moong of present day, and kalya, that is the matar. So these are mentioned in the Yajurveda. The Aryan people depended a lot on milk and milk products for their daily food. Cattle was an integral part of the Vedic culture. We find a lot of reference in the Vedic literature to the milk of cows, though that of the buffalo and goat also finds mention. Dadhi, the present dahi or curds, was eaten with rice, barley and soma juice. Curds folded into fresh milk constituted a popular drink, the solid portion being termed as amishka and the liquid portion as vajina. This is similar to the lassi which we continue to drink. So, it is very interesting that when we talk about food, we can see a long continuous chain, So, the Vedic people were also using lassi to a large extent and it continues to be a very popular drink even today in parts of Punjab. Another modern day eatable is the Shrikarni or the Shrikhand as we call it. It is very much popularized and a favorite dish in Maharashtra. We find a lot of reference to Shrikarni or the modern day Shrikhand, which uses stained curds, crystal sugar and fragrant herbs which were used. The solid part of the cow ghee was called manda. So we have a lot of reference to these. Besides this, we also have a lot of reference to buttermilk, which was in wide use, and it was turned into a seasoned dish called saga. Some of the ideas which we get on looking at the ancient Indians is that they were all very good farmers. The ancient Aryans cultivated barley, wheat, rice, melons and cotton, and they kept their crops in a central storage in each city. The crops were stored in these big storage bins. They also kept cows, pigs, buffaloes and sheep. In areas where they lived in the banks of river, fishes were also caught and with fish hooks. So probably fish were also an important part of the diet. If we read the literature of the Vedic period, we come to know that they ate both vegetarian and non-vegetarian food. Their main food was product of wheat served with barley or rice along with fish or meat. Vegetarian food, strictly excluding animal or fish meat, it only became a norm when more than half of the population turned towards Buddhism, and it was primarily as a result of following the teachings of Buddha that the practice of non-vegetarianism became very important. Now, it's very important to understand what was the food ethos. See, after all, food does not just mean eating. There are certain etiquettes, there are certain rules, and every culture has evolved certain ethos with regards to food. Then definitely for the Aryans, food was not simply a means of bodily sustenance. It was very much a part of a cosmic moral circle. The Taittiriya Upanishad states clearly, from earth sprang herbs, from herbs food, from food seed, from seed man. Man thus consists of the essence of food. From food are all creatures produced, by food do they grow. The self consists of food, of breath, of mind, of understanding, of bliss. So, this in short sums up the whole Vedic philosophy towards food. Food is a very essential item. They equated food along with that of breath, of mind, of understanding, and even reaching that higher stage of being one with the sublime, attaining eternal bliss. So food in the Aryan culture was not something which was to be washed away, saying that, okay, it is of a little significance. Again, if you read the Bhagavad Gita also states that it is from food that all creatures come into being. So it also gives a lot of importance to food, and we find that in the great Aryan cosmic cycle, the eater, the food he eats, and the universe all must be in harmony. See, unless these three elements are not in harmony, you cannot really have a healthy body. And there was a lot of emphasis saying that unless the body is healthy, you cannot have a healthy mind. And only within a healthy body resides a healthy mind, and then you could pray to reach the sublime. So, the whole food ethos was something which was very important to the Aryans. It was only during this period that a number of rules regarding food came up into existence. And we find, this whole concept of pollution became intimately woven to cooking and eating practices. For example, even today, many of us, the women who work in the kitchen know that it is unthinkable for a housewife to taste the food which she has cooked. And this is something, the whole rules evolved during the Aryan period, and it was really unthinkable for a housewife to taste any dish which she has prepared during the course of its preparation. Another rule which came up into prominence at this time, that water must never be sipped from a tumbler, but it should be poured in the mouth from above, since they felt that one's own saliva was something which was polluting. And another very important rule which developed was that water used for rinsing the mouth must be cast out. It should never be swallowed. And another important ritual which developed was that sprinkling of water had a strong connotation of purification. You had to purify the leaf before eating. And I am sure many of you are familiar with these practices. In many households, you would find your mothers or sisters or anyone who's cooking would never taste the meal in between. We never, swallow the water with which we rinse our mouth. And by and large, in many cultures, water is not drunk directly from the glass. And even today, in many restaurants, at least in the south I am familiar, when you go to a restaurant where they serve you food on a plantain leaf, you first sprinkle water and clean the leaf. So in that sense, we feel very happy that in spite of all our diversity in Indian culture, there is a kind of continuity which has come down to us historically. Now let's talk a little about the Buddhist period. What are the kind of changes that occurred with the coming of Buddhism? It's very important to understand that Buddhism, Jainism and Sikhism, they all crystallized out of a Hindu matrix. And therefore, in terms of food and food practices, they had a large number of features which were very common with the Hindu ethos, and yet it also developed its own distinct elements. In the Lagvatra Sutra, Buddha is recorded as saying, and this is what he says, I enjoy the taking of food made out of rice, barley, wheat, mudga, baha, masura and other grains, ghee, oil of sesame, honey, molasses, sugar, fish, eggs and others which are full of soul qualities but devoid of faults. They were consumed by the Aryans and by the rishis of yore. So again, in this statement which is attributed to Buddha, Buddha is talking about the same kind of cereals which the Aryans were using, and he says that since they were consumed by Aryans, they were respected by the rishis of yore, and therefore this is the kind of food which even Buddha enjoys eating. But there were very strict rules which had developed with regards to eating of food, and by and large in the Sangha, the Buddhist monks were advised to eat solid foods only between sunrise and noon. They had to eat nothing between noon and sunrise till the next day. And it was strongly believed that if they followed the strict regime of eating food only between sunrise and noon and keep the stomach empty for rest of the time, it would lead to a lot of subduing of their passion. And only once your passion is subdued would you be able to reach a spiritual height. And reaching spiritual height was something which was very important to a Buddhist monk. And therefore, the whole rules in which the whole Sangha was following was that they would not eat food between noon and till the sunrise the next day. Again, another very important feature which developed was Buddha himself favored non-injury, and he was strongly opposed to ritual sacrifice. We have enough evidence for this, and yet there is again another evidence that Buddha permitted his followers to eat animal flesh, and the rule being, provided this animal flesh came out of a killing which was unintentional. If the animal had died maybe through a natural death on its own due to some other circumstances, and a human being had not killed the animal intentionally with the purpose of eating. Then they could consume the animal flesh. But by and large, many of the people in the Buddhist period had slowly turned to grains, cereals, and vegetarianism was being followed. And again, we have evidence that when the Mauryans came into India by about 300 BC, many people had turned to vegetarianism. You know, this was primarily as a result of the impact of Buddha, and all of us know that Ashoka himself did a lot to propagate Buddhism, spread the whole philosophy and ideology of Buddha in different parts of not only India but across the world in Southeast Asia. And though, you know, a large number of people had turned to vegetarianism during the time of the Mauryas, yet we do have evidence that eating of meat was something which was not totally given up. And there was a strong philosophy that animal sacrifice added to your karma, and it did not release you from reincarnation. And therefore, you know, by and large, people gave up having animal sacrifices because, you know, they wanted to accumulate good karma and be relieved from this whole cycle of birth and death. Many of the inscriptions and edicts of Ashoka, they not only preach non-killing powerfully, but he himself practiced it. The Girnar stone inscription in Gujarat states, and I quote, "No living being may be slaughtered for sacrifice, no festive gathering may be held. Formerly slaughtering in the king's kitchen was great, now it has almost stopped." So Ashoka himself was advocating non-violence and advocating the non-killing of animals. So by and large, there is a move towards vegetarianism which you can find under Ashoka. Again, when we come to the Gupta period, we find that by 650 AD, the worship of mother goddesses came into prevalence, and this is almost a period where there is a lot of you know, worship of cows. The cow worship also became important, and it is primarily from this period that many of the Hindus stopped eating beef completely. You know, there is a theory which saying that the cattle were very important because India was an agricultural country and they would get a lot of milk products, which was very important for the sustenance of the people who had become vegetarian since the time of Buddha. And therefore, you know, though we do not have much evidence of the earlier period, from the time of the Guptas, people really stopped eating beef, and you know, this became something which was unthinkable for a Hindu. And by and large, in the Gupta period, people mostly ate vegetables, cereals, fruits, bread, and they drank a lot of milk, and there was a lot of reliance on milk products during this period. Now, you know, if you, what was the philosophy of food during this time? If you look at the whole traditional Indian medical system of Ayurveda, it classifies food into three kinds. You know, one is the sattvic food, the rajasic food, and the tamasic food. And the classification of food is done based on the character and the effect the food has on the body, on the mind. I think I have already explained to you that right from the Aryan period, there was a lot of emphasis which was given to having a healthy body. And unless you have a healthy body, you cannot have a healthy mind. And therefore, food becomes very important to have a healthy body in order to have a healthy mind. And therefore, sattvic food was a food which was the most simplest, the easiest to digest kind of food. This food was food which contained most of its nutritional values, as it was cooked by using minimum heat and modest processing. There was very little processing which was involved in this food. It provides the necessary energy to the body without taxing it. And it is also considered as a foundation of the higher state of consciousness. That is why most of the saints and seers, they still continue to rely on sattvic food, and this food is supposed to be very close to the gods. It can take you into that state. And a very important aspect of the sattvic food is that it should be taken fresh immediately after it is prepared. You should not wait for a long time. Some of the examples of sattvic food are fresh, juicy fruits, vegetables. Again, they make a distinction between vegetables which are easily digestible, milk and milk products, whole soaked or also sprouted beans, grains and nuts. Many herbs and spices are consumed in their natural and near natural form. And all these are very good examples of sattvic food. Again, it's not that the sattvic food does not use herbs. They also use herbs. And we find that some of the herbs which are recommended in a sattvic food are ginger, turmeric, coriander, cardamom, cinnamon, and aniseed. And these can be used in moderate measure in a sattvic food. So the sattvic food is placed at the highest level in the whole chain of food. The second category of food is the rajasic food. The rajasic food is rich in flavor, but it is very heavy to digest. It is only suitable for people who do arduous physical work. The examples of rajasic food are vegetables which are cooked in excess butter with spicy and strong flavoring agents, and it is also cooked fresh. Rajasic food is rich in nutrients and with minimum dilution with water. It's more thick in consistency. Another important feature of a rajasic food is it depends heavily on salt and sugar, and compared to a sattvic food, the rajasic food takes a long time to digest because it is very heavy in its consistency. It does not consist of liquidy matter. And once a person takes rajasic food, it calls for extended sleeping hours, and it is also sexually stimulating. And therefore, sattvic food which have been fried in oil too much, a sattvic food can also be turned into a rajasic food if it uses too much oil, it is cooked for a long time, and it is eaten in excess. And if there is a specific, the spices are very strong, they are exciting, bitter, if they are pungent, hot, and all these, so there is really not much difference in that sense. A sattvic food relies on very little spices, it is more fresh cooked, it is light, it uses less ghee. But a rajasic food is one which uses excessive ghee, lot of spices, lot of oil. And we find that it is believed that the rajasic food eater is usually very aggressive and overflowing with energy, because the rajasic food increases the speed and excitement of the human organism. The third kind of food is the tamasic food. It is something which is regarded as the worst type of food among all the three kinds of food. The category of tamasic food are dry, unnatural, overcooked, stale, decaying and processed food which make a tamasic diet. Tamasic diet consists of a large amount of energy while being digested. We can have various examples of tamasic food, refined food, be it cereals, oils or hydrogenated butter, stimulants and beverages like tea, coffee, soft drink, fast and ready to eat foods. I think all of you are familiar. These are great favorite foods with us, the pizzas, the pastries, the chocolates, and the incompatible foods as well as intoxicants like tobacco, alcohol, they are all examples of tamasic food. I am sure today you have understood for the first time that the pizza or the burger which the youth relishes so much is an example of tamasic food. And in the Indian system of food, the highest category is given to the sattvic food, followed by rajasic food. But unfortunately, today all of us have moved into liking and eating tamasic food. And the people in the past believed that a tamasic diet is basically based on ignorance and based on doubt, pessimism, and it leads the person who eats the tamasic food into a very painful and sick life. It's not a sign of healthiness. And a tamasic person is always at serious discomfort with himself and his body. And therefore, you know, in the long run, it cannot lead to a healthy life or a healthy lifestyle. Therefore, you know, if we read the literature of the past, you know, we get enough evidence of what is the kind of food. Obviously, there would be a major class difference between the people eating food. You know, the poor peasant in the field would have a different diet, and obviously the person of the royal family would have a different diet. And we get a lot of information on the royal diet if we read the Sanskrit and the regional literature, especially from 1000 to 1500 AD. A very good example is of King Someshwara III. He is the Western Chalukya king who ruled from 1126 to 1138 AD. To him is attributed the Sanskrit work Abhala Sahitrata Chintamani, and it is better known as Manosolasa, meaning the refresher of mind. Manosolasa, you know, the refreshing of the mind. In all, this book contains 100 chapters and they are divided into 5 equal books. And we find that it is in the chapter on Anna Bhoga that he has given various recipes. You know, King Someshwara was very much interested in food, and we find a large number of recipes. Some of these recipes are very detailed, you know, they go into details of how the food has to be prepared, cooked, served, and the others are given in a very short form. And what is very interesting, you know, that many of the dishes which Someshwara is talking, and let me remind you, he is talking in the period, you know, his period is between 1126 to 1130. And many of the dishes which he talks about, their preparation, etc., they, you know, they are very familiar to today's people, I am sure all over India, because we have developed a pan-India kind of a culture today, but they are very current in Kannada, Marathi and Tamil speaking areas. Now, what are the dishes that he is talking? The preparation he is giving is for making idli, for making desai, that is the present day dosha, the vadai, the vadas, the dahi vada, which is again a very popular dish, poli, vadia, shrikhand, feni and laddu. And I am sure all of you are familiar with all these eatables. So, you know, the king is very familiar with them. He goes at length talking in detail about their preparations and how they are made. But again, what is very interesting in this book is, though the king does talk about the vegetarian food, he is more interested in non-vegetarian food. In fact, he pays more attention to the non-vegetarian food. And he makes a very interesting point. And he says that even though the food prepared and served in earthen vessels taste well, but kings must be served in vessels made of gold. So, you know, he realizes that if a food is cooked in an earthen pot, you know, which many centuries back we in India were doing. But he says that though this is the best food, but a king must be served in a golden vessel. So, you know, class takes over the taste in food according to him. In his book, if we read his book carefully, we find that meat items have a pride of place. You know, he talks about liver which is carved into a globular shape of betel nuts, which is then roasted on charcoal and then fried with spices, eventually to be placed in curds on a decoration of black mustard. You know, it's almost similar to some of the way in which meat dishes are prepared today. He also talks about roasted tortoise, seasoned fish, fried crabs, and saying, you know, these are the delicacies which he relishes. Again, in one recipe, he talks about pieces of meat being mixed with a paste of gram pounded with spices and fried. To this were added tender hyacinth beans, certain berries, onion and garlic, and the whole mass is taken up, and to it is added some sour juice, and it is flavored. You know, you almost get a feeling that you are reading a cookbook of present day, you know, where there are recipes which are being shown as to how to prepare a dish. So he takes, you know, so we know something, a fact of history which is not known to many students, that many kings, they were not only interested in arts, building buildings, building huge temples, they contributed a lot to art and literature, but some kings even contributed a lot to cuisine, and they were very much interested in how food was cooked and prepared. We get to know a large number of tastes which constituted a royal meal. You know, there were different kinds of tastes which are spoken of. One is madhura. You know, there should be sweet, amala, sour, lavana, salty, kata, that is pungent, and shushruta, and tikta, that is bitter, tikha as we say, and kasya, that is astringent. And these are foods which are prescribed by Shushruta around 600 AD. So, you know, all these tastes are brought into the royal meat. The Bhavishya Katha, which is around 1000 AD, also describes the royal meat of King Shrenika. You know, it gives us a long discourse on how the food is served. And King Shrenika is first served with fruits to be chewed, that is grapes, pomegranate and bear. Then fruits to be sucked, such as sugarcane, oranges and mangoes. In the third category came food that could be licked, and in the fourth course came solid sweet items like sevaka, modaka and feneka. The next item or the next course was of rice, the fifth course, and the sixth was of broth. Curds preparation followed the seventh course, and the eighth course ended with thickened milk flavored with saffron. And in this whole course, items such as prapata, that is papad, and vataka, that is vada, were very common. So, you know, it talks of a long 8-course meal with which the king is served. And, you know, it follows a very scientific development. You start with fruits which can be chewed, then sucked, then you lick the food, and then, you know, you also have solid items. You also eat rice followed by broths and curds. And even today, you know, to a large extent, the way South Indian food is eaten in India, it follows certain courses like this. You know, you start with dry vegetables, then you have the broth, and the meal always ends with curd. So again, this is an example of continuity in our food habits till today. Now, another very interesting development which occurs is with the coming of Islam. And definitely, this also changed the food habits of the people. And we have enough evidence that by 1100 AD, many people stopped eating pork because it was not allowed by the Quran. And definitely, in terms of our environment, we find that this non-killing of pigs or not eating of porks had an effect on our environment, because pigs by and large do not destroy forest in which they live, and sheep and goats do. So in some sense, though this is an area where really not much study has taken place, but definitely this would have had an impact on the environment much more. And today, all of us are familiar with the typical Indian food. The Indian thali today consists of roti, dal, cereals, which are easily grown in an dry, arid atmosphere where there is less of green vegetables. And what is interesting, obviously for a common person, the thali continues from that period till today. The items may be a few less or more, but by and large, this is what was the Indian thali in the past, and it continues to a large extent till today. One of a very rich source of understanding about food is Ibn Battuta. Ibn Battuta was a Moroccan traveler who came to India, and he noted a lot of observations about India. And it is very interesting to read him, because he talks a lot about administration. He gives us a lot of information about society, about the kinds of different practices, because everything was new to him, and wherever he went, whatever he observed, he tried to note it down. And what is very interesting is Ibn Battuta describes the food which is served in the table of the rich. He says the dinner consists of bread, roasted meat, that shivavoon, round pieces of bread split and filled with sweet paste, rice and chicken, dojas. Again, earlier Amir Khusro also describes about the food eaten by nobility. Their food consists generally of sharbate labgir, that is a very sweetened kind of sharbat. All of us know that the drinks which we take in summer is referred to as sharbat, and all of us are familiar with that. He also refers to naan-e-tunuk, that is light bread, naan-e-tanuri, chapatis which are made in tandoors, samosas which are filled with meat, ghee, onion, etc., mutton, flesh of various birds such as quail, sparrow, kunjuk shaka, and he also talks of halwa and sabuni sarkar. So, most of these dishes are familiar to the Indians, and a large number of people, whether it's Ibn Battuta or Amir Khusro, they refer to the food eaten by the royalty. By and large, the kind of literature which we have for the medieval period in India, it is mostly focusing on the nobility. It talks about kings, and it does not give us much idea about the common persons, and so by and large, they refer to the food habits, the table of the rich. Both Ibn Battuta and Amir Khusro also talk about people being accustomed to drinking wine. They refer a lot to the wine parties, and they say that after the meal they used to take tambol. Tambol is the betel leaf or the pan for refreshing the palate, and this is something which continues even till today. And another very interesting point which they make is that frequently nobles would eat together. See, unlike the earlier period where there are all these rules of, taboos of pollution and purity, and food is eaten individually, there is more communal eating in the medieval period, and most of the nobles would sit together, they would eat together. And another interesting point which they refer to, that after the food is being eaten, all the unconsumed food which is left over is distributed to fakirs and beggars. So, you know, the food is not wasted, it is distributed among these sections of society. One point which we should always remember when we are talking about food is that there is a lot of diversity in Indian food. You know, by and large, I am talking about the broad trends, but definitely, you know, there are many factors which shape food, and one is the religious factor, the geographical location, the climatic conditions, and the traditions which have evolved over a period of time. And all these combine and influence the preparation of Indian food. They have combined and influenced the preparation of Indian food in the past, and it continues to a large extent today. And essentially spicy Indian food, the cuisine is however not very hot. It consists of different combination of handful of spices that are produced in the most delectable dishes in the world. Another thing which is very important with the coming of Islam is that people started eating more and more fruits during this time. There is a large scale use of fruits at this time. We have a lot of reference to you know, citrus fruits like lemons and oranges, which were grown in large numbers, were eaten very frequently. In fact, from the Tarikh-e-Firoz Shahi, we come to know that Firoz Tughlaq laid a large number of mango gardens, and many of these gardens had a lot of mangoes which were eaten by the people. Another very important factor which we find with the coming of Mughals is that there is a lot of Persian influence on food with the coming of Mughals. The food from North India traces its descent from the Persian ancestors, and mostly from the 16th century with the coming of Mughals. The Mughals brought into India with them Persian and Afghani cooks who started in North India with the rich and fragrant Persian rice dishes such as pilavs and biryanis. You know, a large number of meat-based pilavs, or you know, the pulavs as we call them today. These were garnished with pounded silver, the vark which we call. These dishes along with spicy kormas, which again became a favorite dish of the Mughals. You know, the spicy korma was braised meat in a creamy sauce. The koftas, the grilled spicy meatballs which were dipped into this gravy. And they used a large amount of kebabs of different variety. And all this kind of food, you know, the biryanis, the pilavs, the kormas, the koftas and the kebabs used to grace the table of the Mughal emperors. We find a lot of Central Asian nomadic influence in the meat dishes, and especially, you know, the communal eating which came up during this period. And most of the people from Central Asia initially had a kind of a communal eating. They were living in tents because most of them had led the life of a warrior, and this had a lot of impact on the dish. When Babur came to India, you know, he was also very fond of eating fruits, and he laid a large number of orchards. Babur lived for only 4.5 years when he came to India, but then, you know, he kept lamenting the fact that this country had no grapes, musk melon or first-rate fruits, no ice or cold water, no bread, cooked food in the bazaars. You know, Babur in his Tuzuke Babari keeps lamenting about his homeland. He keeps talking about Fargana and, you know, Kandar and the beautiful fruits which you had, the juicy musk melons and he finds none of the fruits in India could match that quality which he had, and he always talks in great nostalgia about his homeland. He could never go back to his homeland, and he was very critical of Indians. He says Indians are not at all civilized people, they don't know the art of good living. I was the one who showed them that they can have a nice time in the gardens, roam around in the gardens, use ice and have cold water. So he brought these niceties of life to India when he came. He makes a detailed reference to many of the fruits found in India. He says chironji is a thing between an almond and the walnut, and not so bad, he comments. So at least he has something nice to speak about the chironji, but he is very critical of the other kinds of fruits which he found no match to the fruits which were grown in his homeland. And again, another very important point which he says is the flesh of the Hindustani fishes is very savory. They have no odor or tiresomeness. The tiresomeness most probably meant that they didn't have so many bones, so that you could eat them easily without being tired. But by and large, though Babar is fond of Indian chironji and fishes in a small extent, he is very alien to Indian food. He, in his heart, he continued to like the fruits and food of his own homeland, and he was never very comfortable with Indian food. And what is interesting is, though Babar remained very aloof to the Indian supper table, his son Humayun took to them much more easily, and he was introduced to new items. All of us know the political history of Humayun, that he had a very difficult time. He had lost his kingdom, and he spent a lot of time wandering around when Sher Shah Suri occupied the throne in Delhi. And we come to know that Humayun also gave up the eating of animal flesh for some months, especially during the period when he was campaigning to recover his throne. And after much reflection, he decides that beef is not a food for the devout. And it's very interesting, to see how the Mughals are slowly being Indianized, and the process completes with the coming of Akbar. And he gives up beef to a large extent. And it is primarily with the coming of Akbar, through his book, the Aine-Akbari, that we know that of many new recipes, oven and other kinds of new recipes which are brought into India, and many of these came into India through the Mughal courts. Aine-Akbari describes 3 kinds of classes of cooked dishes. It says the first one is called Safiana, and it is consumed on Akbar's day of abstinence. And Akbar would abstain from eating meat on certain days, and on this, the Safiana food, no meat was used, and most of the dishes are those which are made with rice, zard, biranj, khushka. It would be something like khichdi or sheer birans, and it would either be of wheat, that is chikki, there would be dal, palak saag, halwa, sharbat. And I am sure many of these terms are familiar to you. We continue to eat khichdi, it's a very popular dish. Sharbats are very common, and palak saag and dal, these are all very important part of a diet. So these were food which were called the Safiana. It's almost like the Sattvic food which I referred to earlier, and it was consumed on days when Akbar would either worship a pir, on birthdays where he would not eat meat. The second class of food comprised of that in which both meat and rice were used, and it was primarily food like pulao, biryani, shula, shorba, or meat, and wheat, that is harissa, dishes, meat dishes made with wheat such as harissa, halim, kushka, khutab or samosa. Or it could be even dishes made with rice along with meat and rice such as biryani, pulao, etc. The third category of food which Ain-e-Akbari refers to is the meat which is cooked with ghee, spices, curd and eggs are used in this. And he talks a lot about dishes such as yakhini, kabab, do pyaja, dam fukat, kalia and malugruba. So, and many of these dishes can be found in restaurants. Another major contributions of the Mughals was that they contributed kulfi to India. Kulfi is still a very popular sweet dish. It is almost an equivalent to an ice cream. And kulfi was made at courts. Obviously it was not eaten by the common people. These delicacies were primarily for the upper class people. And it was made at court by freezing a mixture of khoa, pista nut and saffron. And it was put in a metal coal, and after sealing the top, it was only open on the top with dough. The only difference is that today mostly kulfi is made in either a plastic or an aluminum cone. These were still not discovered during the Mughal period. So they used the cone made of different kinds of metal. But kulfi is something which is a contribution of the Mughals. Another dish which is attributed to Jahangir, and again it's a very favorite dish, is the faluda. And Jahangir enjoyed meat, unlike his father or grandfather who remained either abstained from eating meat on particular days or gave it up for a certain period of time. Jahangir enjoyed eating meat, and he also popularized the faluda. The faluda was a jelly which was made from boiled wheat. It was strained and mixed with a large number of fruit juices and cream, and then it was served. So definitely, if you look at the food from 16th century, we find that the Mughals were great patrons of cooking. They introduced rich gravies, pilafs, non-vegetarian fare such as kebabs, and the whole concept of Mughlai cuisine, which is very popular today. Every restaurant would have a section saying Mughlai cuisine. They own it to the period of the Mughals because they used a lot of fruits such as apricots, melon, peaches and plum in the cooking. And we had lavish dishes which were prepared in the Mughlai, the so-called Mughlai way as we call it today, during the reign of Jahangir and Shah Jahan. In the Deccan, the Nizams developed their own style. They perfected their own style of cooking. And one of the popular dishes today is the biryani. The Hyderabad biryani is very famous, and it is regarded as a one of the connoisseurs of the finest dishes of non-vegetarian. Now, by the end of 16th century, a new development takes place in India, and you have the Europeans who are coming in. So now let me talk a little about the impact. Obviously, when a new culture is coming, when new people are coming into India, they are also going to contribute to their food, to the existing food. And when the Portuguese came into India, they brought food from the New World. They brought for the first time potato, tomato, tapioca, groundnuts, corn, papaya, pineapple, guava, avocado, rajma, that is the kidney beans, cashew, sapota, the chiku, and of course capsicum and chili. And all these foods came up with them at that time. And most probably we also hear of cauliflower and cabbage. These came from Europe or Latin America, And we find that definitely, a kind of cottage cheese is attributed to the Portuguese. They brought with them cottage cheese. And we find that slowly, the kind of, we also hear of chana of Bengal and Orissa, which became a very important ingredient in many of the Bengali sweets. The Bengali sweets like sandesh in its modern form, or the rasagolla, the kheer mohan, the mochak, the pantua, sita bhog, chena poda, and all of them, use chana to a large extent. And this was something which became very popular during the time of the Portuguese. The Portuguese brought a lot of fusion in our food. The Portuguese word for grain was garo, and it was taken up to describe the Indian pulses such as Bengal gram, chana, which I referred to, horse gram and other grams. So, there is a lot of fusion in Indian food. While the Arabs and Central Asians brought bajra, jawar, lobia and forms of bread, roti into India, the Portuguese enriched Indian food through their diverse introduction. Even today, when you eat aloo puri, I want to tell you to remember that in eating the aloo puri, we partake a part of food that is produced from West Asia to Latin America. You can see that long chain which connects our Indian food. Now, let me talk a little about the Europeans who came and settled, the English who came and settled. The early Europeans also had lavish tables, and if you read, Mandel Slow is writing in 1638, and talking about, the dishes being served, he points out that there were 15 or 16 dishes of meat besides desserts in the house of the president of the English merchants of Surat. So he's talking of a very small region in Surat, and the president of the merchants of Surat, and you have more than 15 or 16 meat dishes which are being served, along with different kinds of naan, chapati, etc. So obviously it's a very lavish table which is laid. Another very interesting writing which we get is from 1780, and Mrs. Eliza Fay, she is a lawyer's wife, and by profession she is a dressmaker. She makes dresses, and she writes in her diary, she says, "We dine at 2 o'clock in the heat of the day." India is very hot for them. So we dine at 2 o'clock in the very heat of the day, a soup, a roast fowl, curry, rice, a mutton pie, 4 quarters of lamb, a rice pudding, tarts, very good cheese, freshly churned butter, excellent Madeira, which is very expensive, but eatables are very cheap. So, she talks about drinks being expensive, but food being very cheap. So, they obviously had a very heavy lunch at 2 o'clock. However, when we look at it, it was not so easy to prepare so many dishes. Obviously, all these European officials had a huge array of servants or khidmat guards, as they are referred. And many of these khidmat guards continue to work in the kitchen from morning to evening, preparing a large number of these dishes. And obviously, after having such a heavy lunch at 2 o'clock, it was followed by a siesta, because you had to take rest. And the evening visits followed after the siesta, and by and large dinner was light. Obviously, after having such a heavy meal at 2 o'clock, you cannot have a heavy dinner at night. So, the pattern which was there in the early 18th or beginning of 19th century was a very heavy noon lunch, followed by a light sister. But however, you know, by the turn of the 20th century, we find that the total eating habits of the people had changed. The midday meal becomes very light by this time, and by 1910 we have on record that the lunch consists of a pea soup, a roasted chicken and tongues, bread sauce, potato, cheese macaroni and lemon pudding. The main meal of night is now moved to 8 o'clock in the evening, and by 1909 Maud Divers declares, you know, India is a land of dinners and England is the land of 5 o'clock teas. All India is in a chronic state of giving and receiving this form of hospitality. So many of these European officers who came, in England tea continued to be very important, having the evening tea, and people socialize over the tea. But in India, you know, dinners became very important. So the dinners are shifted to late night, and today also we follow the same practice. You generally have a light meal during lunch followed by a dinner which is late at night, and it is this kind of a attitude which we continue to have about food. Now the Indian food, whether it is the robust fare of Punjab or the northwest frontier or the delicate flavors of South Indian cuisine, was by and large, you know, to the Europeans only food of the natives. They, you know, to them, they, you know, they had this whole theory of a white man's burden. They had come to India to govern India, to rule India, and the only reason they were getting close to the people, trying to know about their culture, was in order to get a better understanding of the people whom they were ruling. But at the back of their mind was this whole philosophy of the white man's burden, the whole you know, theory of trying to civilize the barbarians. And therefore, you know, whatever foods the Indians were eating, to them, you know, it was the food of the natives. To them, the natives ate pungent, chili spiked curries and rice or roti like some uncivilized pagans. You know, the Indians were still not using a lot of cutlery, forks, etc., which was very common with the Britishers. The Britishers were in India not to learn, and they, as well as the other Europeans here, were to civilize the people, the backward masses of India. And therefore, you know, they were looking down upon food of India, but a natural corollary to this, you know, adding on to this. And we find that the Mem Sahib, you know, the housewife, whether they are British, French or Portuguese, they employed a large number of Indian khansamas. They had a large array of khidmatgars who were working. They had a large number of cooks and bearers, but they taught them their own cuisine. They taught them their own way of cooking rather than eating Indian meals at innumerable parties and family dishes. And by and large, many British officers and the civil administrators looked upon the native cuisine as something which was unhygienic, unpalatable, because of the high content of spices and herbs. And it is very interesting if you read the accounts of many of the kings at that time, you know, who were throwing lavish party for the British officers. They also started employing a large array of the cooks who could cook Western food. So in an Indian table, when a prince was giving dinners, you know, you had an array of Indian food which was served, but you also had an equal amount of the British food which was served. And therefore, in that sense, you know, the British made very little contribution to Indian food. And whether it is fish and chips or Yorkshire pudding, you know, the contribution which the British made in the form of fish and chips or Yorkshire pudding, you know, it fails and it pales in comparison to what we got from the Arabs, the Portuguese and the Mughals. But definitely one area where the British contributed a lot was in the area of apple. They brought in some of the best apples to India. And we find that there is a local variety of apple which are recorded to have occurred in Kashmir. You know, we have reference to the period 1100 AD when it is called Amri, Tarheli or Maharaji. And there is also a reference to Dalhara where it talks about a bear which is as big as a fist and very sweet, and it is grown in northern Kashmir. So most probably this is referring to the apple as we know it today. So they were familiar with some kind of an apple, but it was the colorful British Frederick. You know, he is popularly known as Pahari Wilson. He contributed a lot and he established a flourishing apple farm in Gadwal where they grew rich and red and juicy apples. They are known as Wilson apples till today. Then, you know, Himachal Pradesh became a very favorite place for growing apples, and there was a systematic effort by the British to see that apples grow in Himachal. You know, the British had come from a cool land, you know, in Britain or London, and they found the climate in India very hot. So they would move into cooler places like Shimla during summer. They tried to rule. And some of the hill stations of India like Darjeeling, Dalhousie, and you know, places like Lansdowne, Shimla and Nainital, these became the favorite places of the British. They found a lot of similarity in the climate of the hill station in India and the climate back home. And therefore, you know, they brought in, they developed systematically the apples. And we find that after British, you know, it was the Americans also who contributed to an extent. And especially, you know, today we know America only in terms of importing to India its pizzas, burgers, French fries and the colas. But I think as students, it is important to remember that the Americans also brought to us apple. You know, and the most important American is Mr. Stokes, and he settled in Kotgarh near Shimla. He also married a local Himachali woman, and in 1920s he started an apple orchard there. He taught the people how to grade apples, how to pack apples, and he also took a lot of interest in marketing. You know, those of you would read his autobiography, you know, he does not look like an American. He adapted the Pahadi way of dressing, the cap, the shirt and the dress of the Himachal, and his children were also given names after the Himachali names, and he made the apple very popular in Himachal, and from here it traveled to different places. We have you know, the colonial rulers were never known for their linguistic accuracy, and it's very difficult to point out from where the British got the term curry, you know, K-A-R-I as they spelt it. Today we say C-U-R-R-Y. But, you know, curry is referred to as the sauce or the tarkari of a North Indian dish. You know, a dish which is made with gravy. But curry became a very popular item with the British. And slowly, you know, initially the British were very hesitant. They didn't like Indian food. But over a period of time, when they settled for a long time, we find that they became very, you know, comfortable in Indian food. And we find that especially you know, when they attended the Shikar festivals, which a large number of Maharajas had organized for them, you know, there would be lavish royal meals served at this sites. You know, it would be an opulent, there would be chandeliers, huge dining halls, and a large amount of the riyasati food was served. You had all these turbaned waiters, all dressed up in the best finery. The food was served in gem-studded or gold and silver vessels. Each Maharaja was trying to outdo the other, and they were known for their, India is known as a land for hospitality. They bent backwards in trying to please the British officials, and they had these lavish dinners which were organized, followed by shikar. They would go out for 3-4 days, they would have elaborate lunches, and therefore we find that throughout the colonial period many new hybrid cuisines came into India. And some of these developed by innovative khansamas who tried to mix the British cuisine with the kind of Indian dish. Some were innovated by the Mem Sahibs who were taking care of the whole kitchen. And we find that slowly, they started liking food which was a combination of the British, French and the Portuguese food. It was definitely a legacy of the Raj era that today, we have remnants of the Anglo-Indian, Indo-French and the Indo-Portuguese cuisine which is very much alive in India. And these flourished in parts of India, in Britain or Europe, where, the memories of the Raj linger on. And naturally, when the British left India, when India became independent, by this time, the British had fallen in love with the Indian flavors, whether it is the Sahib or the Mem Sahibs. They loved the flavors of India. And naturally, when they went back to their homeland, they always took with them, either the cooks from here or they would carry a mix of spices, and they sprinkled it on the British food, which to them appeared to be very staid. And, they tried to let's say pep it up by adding some of these spices. And it was, at this time that curry became very popular. They used curry powder, and even today in London and parts of British, they understand Indian food as only curry, something which is cooked in a sauce. Definitely, during the British period, a kind of mini revolution occurred, and there were changes in the food and eating habits of the high sections of Indian society, and we find that the tastes of India are slowly changing, and the affluent Western Indian families now started eating on dining tables. They started using a lot of cutlery like forks, spoons, knives, and they added to their menu at least one of the Western dishes like baked dishes, cakes, puddings and ice cream. This became an important part of the menu of the upper classes. And again we find that the food, though it is cooked in their own style, it also included certain acceptable Western items which became part of their daily diet. Now, when I come to the modern period, let me also talk a little about the Chinese influence which is there on our food. And it was not only the Europeans, people like the French, the Dutch or the Europeans who had come to India influenced our food. The Chinese also influenced our food, and primarily, fruits like mulberry, blackberry and lychee came into India through the Chinese. And the Chinese also brought in the sweet cherry and the peach. They developed a kind of a leafy vegetable called the Brassica junecia, the rye which we understand, which is a favorite leafy vegetable in Punjab today, and many Indians use it as a vegetable. Camphor was also a Chinese import, and it was introduced into India. It is called the Chenkapura today. And then you also have the import of soya bean into India. In 1908, it was brought in for cultivation, though it caught on widely in India only after the US varieties were introduced into India in 1970s. And now, you know, soya bean is a very popular item in India. And in spite of all this, you know, the most precious introduction to China was the chai, the tea which we drink. You know, today you cannot imagine getting up in the morning without your cup of tea in many households, and this is definitely a Chinese import. And you know, I just want to take you back into history. Just imagine, what do we do today? You know, we get up in the morning, we pay obeisance to the Arab by drinking a cup of coffee which was brought into the 60s, and we pay obeisance to the Chinese by drinking a cup of tea which was introduced by them. So we own a lot of you know, our food habits to different cultures, different people. Yet another point which I want to talk about when I talk about food is, however, the large mass of Indian population, you know, it was still very much dominated by caste and religion, and it riddled Indian society, and it maintained to a large extent the original food barriers, and they ate you know, in community or the regional food, which was a legacy for generations. And caste and religion are the main dividing partitions of Indian society. And therefore, you know, the food which is eaten by these different communities based on caste, on religion, it follows a major divide of these religions. And only it was after independence that Indians realized that we are one nation and we have to work towards a homogeneous culture. And there was a kind of a, you know, development of a pan-Indian culture, where there is a lot of emphasis on lifestyle and national awareness. And the days of the British, you know, the last days of the British, where they followed a policy of divide and rule, sections of citizens were kept separate, you know, caste played a major dominant role. I think though these problems still linger, you know, region continues to be important, caste continues to be important, but there is a realization that we have to move about this. And in that sense, we find that food plays a major role, because the youth have really taken over to a large number of food. And by this time, the French had vacated from Pondicherry, Mahe and Karikal. The Portuguese were soon out of Goa, Daman and Diu. And therefore, you know, you had the first signs of a massive food revolution, which started in Mumbai. It became visible in Mumbai, one of the most cosmopolitan cities in India. It welcomed hordes of Sindhis and Punjabi refugees who had migrated into the city. They entered the building film industry and they began to assert their culture in the whole metropolis. And we find that the Punjabi dhaba food, which had come from the northwestern frontiers, became very popular in Mumbai around the 60s. The Mumbaiites, who had hitherto relished only non-vegetarian food in the many street corners of the Iranian restaurants, and the khanawalas who were serving fish and meat dishes of the Konkan coast and Goa, they pounced on these luscious kebabs and tandoori cuisine, which was a very new and exciting development. And today, if we look at it, our food is definitely, you know, it is pronounced with the use of lot of spices, a common culinary thread of unifying local cuisine, which includes the prominence of flatbread and a greater use of dairy products than anywhere else in Asia. Breads are made with wheat, rice, ground legumes, depending on which part of the country we are talking about. There is a lot of use of milk, cream, yogurt, buttermilk, cheese, etc. There is also a lot of geographical differences which come up in food. Northern Indians tend to use their spices grounded with the southerners, start with whole spices and then grind them into a paste. So more whole spices are used in North India. In South, it is more, you know, the paste which is used. And there is a lot of onion and garlic which is used as ingredient in cooking in different parts of India. The south is the land of rice, while northerners rely on wheat and other grains. Except for Kashmir, high in the Himalayas, which produces some of the best rice, the basmati rice. And we also have cooks of the tropical south which make use of heavy use of coconut milk, the ingredients which are rarely seen in the north. There is a lot of use of tamarind in the south, which is not used so much in the north. And areas which are closer to the waterways and the sea, they rely a lot on fish. And therefore, Bengal becomes a region of fish lovers and preferably of the, the fresh variety. Besides, caste, region, religion also plays a major role in food. And the whole Indian food ethos is determined by religion. Centuries of Hindu practices have had a lot of, and their whole belief in reincarnation have had a lot of impact on some of the most delicacies vegetarian cuisine which is created in India. For proteins, the Indians rely on a large variety of legumes, both whole and split. They are mixed with grains, boosted by vegetables and dairy products, and they are spiced to the maximum, and they provide a wholesome diet. Just as, the Japanese sushi relies on the freshness of meat, the Chinese food relies on a variety of sauces. The Indian food relies on the right mixture of flavor and taste, and this comes about with the result of the spices which are used in cooking. Spices have always been considered to be India's prime commodity. We have a large number of spices which are not only used in food but are also a part of the medicine, and they are known for their flavor and taste. I am sure all of you know, your mothers must have told you to drink hot milk put with some haldi, turmeric if you have hurt yourself. And you have a large number of these kinds of spices which are an integral part of our food, which also are used in medicines. Ginger is said to have originated in India, and it was introduced to China over 3,000 years ago. And in India, a knob of fresh ginger is either added to tea, and it is believed to relieve you of sore throats. It is said to help you in dealing with cold, and it also has certain aphrodisiac properties. Turmeric is again seen as a splendid herb, against spice against skin diseases. Neem leaves are also used to guard against smallpox. And therefore, I would just sum up by saying that, Indian cuisine is amazing. I have taken you through the long journey of how our food has developed, right from Indus Valley civilization to Aryans, where we had the whole ethos which developed, and then, food which becomes more and more vegetarian during the Buddhist period, followed by Mauryas and the Guptas, which become, more and more, India moves away from beef eating. And then the coming of Islam, you have the kind of Mughlai food which is introduced. The Portuguese and the French also introduced their cuisine. And initially, while the British are very hesitant, they don't like Indian food, to them it is a food of the natives. But in the long run, the Mem Sahibs fall in love with the Indian food, and they develop their own way of curry. Besides this, we've also had a lot of American impact on our food, the apples which I introduced. You also have a Chinese impact, the tea which is introduced, along with the coffee introduced by the Arabs. And so, the food which we partake today has evolved over a long period of our history and culture. Thank you.